The subject of today's video was one of the best wide receivers in Notre Dame history, an All-American, a first-round pick, and was a projected star at the NFL level. Unfortunately, though, he was plagued with underwhelming numbers, a suspension, and has become one of the major what-ifs in recent big-time wide receiver prospects. Today, we're going to talk about his story, go through his career, and then ultimately talk about what went wrong for him in the NFL and what he is up to now. But before we can get into it, we're only about 5,000 subscribers away from 100K, so be sure to help me out by hitting that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support today's video, turn on notifications so you never miss my upload, and let me know what player I could take a look at in my next What Happened To video. Now, let's get started. So you're probably wondering who the subject of today's video is, and it is none other than Will Fuller. But in order to understand what went wrong for Will Fuller, we first need to go back in time. Fuller was born and raised in the city of Philadelphia, and he fell in love with the place. So much so that he actually had it tattooed on his arm, and he also fell in love with the game of football, but that was not his first sport. He said, quote, "My first sport was soccer when I was 4 or 5 years old. My mom and dad always tell me that I was too aggressive when I was younger, and I had an accident where I kicked a girl in the face when I was young. I guess it's just a legend now because they always tell me that. I don't remember it though." Will was always aggressive in sports, and it made sense. He was the only guy in the family besides his dad, and he was surrounded by 4 sisters. His high school coach said, quote, "When you're the only boy in the house, I think you're kind of the low man on the totem pole." So I think he's always just had that quiet demeanor about him. Growing up in a house with 4 sisters, Fuller barely said a word. He was polite, borderline invisible, and a kid who wouldn't hurt a fly. But when he was on the football field, the guy was an absolute animal. Before Fuller arrived at Roman Catholic High School, he was under 6 foot tall and only weighed 135 pounds. He was too short, too skinny, too raw, too everything, and never thought he'd have an edge over other recruits, so he decided he was going to start training extremely hard. Fueled by the doubts about his size, Fuller worked with a trainer and got faster, sharpened his footwork, and improved his hand-eye coordination. He learned how to change directions quicker and built upon an extremely explosive first step. He didn't see the field the first game of his sophomore season, but in the second game, he had 3 touchdowns on 5 touches. His high school coach said, quote, "Right then and there, we knew this kid was something special." Early on in his sophomore season, his coach said, quote, "Will, you have the potential to be the best player to ever walk through these halls." From there on, Will's confidence would only increase, and he became a 3-star recruit who was going to have a chance to play college football. But he was going under the radar. Besides Notre Dame, he earned mostly regional offers. He was never on the radar of SEC, Big 12, or Pac-12 programs, not to mention the school he dreamed of playing for, Ohio State. Fuller was not too worried about it though. He said, quote, "That's how my life has always been. When I went to high school, I wasn't recruited. I didn't get picked for any of the big All-American games, and I didn't get picked to the local All-Star game. I had a pretty good year at Notre Dame, and I didn't get picked for any All-American list. That always put a chip on my shoulder and keeps me humble. I always have room to improve." So yeah, he obviously went to Notre Dame, but that was not his first school. His first decision was to choose Penn State, as he chose the Lions over Temple, Boston College, and Rutgers, but unfortunately, the Nittany Lions were in a very interesting spot with the aftermath of the scandal. He committed there right after earning an offer and said, quote, "I told you I wanted to see other schools before I decided, but I talked to the people there, and they said if your heart is at Penn State, just go there." Combining that with its location and his family's love for the school, it seemed like a great fit for Fuller. As a junior in high school, he would catch 46 passes for 758 yards and 10 touchdowns, but was just a merely ranked 3-star kid. His recruitment was not over though. He decided to visit Notre Dame and give them a look, and would eventually flip from the Nittany Lions to the Irish. He said, quote, "Top-notch education really tipped the boat for me. They have a 98% graduation rate for players, and I know I'll have a better opportunity at Notre Dame. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle, but a Notre Dame degree definitely looks good, and a chance to play for them was going to be amazing." What's also funny is a week before he flipped, he apparently said on social media he was 100% committed to Penn State, but I guess things changed rather quickly for him, and those sanctions probably deterred him. Fuller was far from a can't-miss prospect, but Irish fans were excited to see how he would do. According to 24/7 Sports, Fuller was eventually bumped up to a 4-star recruit, was ranked as the number 40 receiver, and the 280th best player in the class of 2013. He had surged up by the end of his high school career, but how would he do in South Bend, Indiana? There are always plenty of big-time recruits that come into Notre Dame, so what was going to make Will Fuller special? Well, at first, nothing. He would appear in 6 games as a freshman in 2013, with his best game coming against Air Force, where he had 2 catches for 93 yards and a touchdown. He finished the season with 6 catches for 160 yards and 1 touchdown, and it was alright for a freshman, but what Fuller would do as a sophomore, no one in the world expected. In their first game against Rice, Fuller would show that he was going to be the guy. He caught 4 passes for 85 yards and a touchdown, and then he had 9 catches for 89 yards and a touchdown in a 31-0 shutout over Michigan. Fuller had immediately established himself as the #1 receiver on the team, and would follow that up with 6 more catches for 50 yards and a score against Purdue. The Irish were now 3-0, and then Fuller would have an even better game. He broke the century mark for the first time in his career as he caught 6 passes for 119 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win over Syracuse, and then 2 weeks later had 7 catches for 133 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win over North Carolina. The Irish were off to a 6-0 start, but then they would lose their first game of the year. This came against #2 Florida State, but Fuller would have nearly 100 yards, 8 catches, and a touchdown in that one. From there, he'd finish out the year strong as he caught touchdown passes in a win over Navy and a loss to Arizona State, and then would have a career game against Northwestern. The Irish somehow lost this game 43-40, but Fuller caught 9 passes for 159 yards and 3 touchdowns. By this time in the year, Fuller had become one of the top receivers in the country and would go out with style. He went for over 100 yards in a score against Louisville and then had 75 yards against USC. Unfortunately, despite a hot start, Notre Dame would lose 5 of their last 6 games. They'd still get selected to play in the Music City Bowl, where they would beat #23 LSU, and Fuller would finish the game with a touchdown, adding to his tremendous season total. He finished the year with 76 catches for 1,094 yards and 15 touchdowns. Despite the strong finish to the season, he was not named an All-American, and he credits his breakout to Brian Kelly. He said, quote, "Kelly came up to me before the season and said, 'You're my guy. You're going to be the star receiver for us.'" Fuller said he took that personal, and because Kelly had faith in him and believed in him, he started to work even harder and would have a great season after that. Fuller had a terrific sophomore campaign, so the hype for him going into his junior year was going to be insane. Going into the 2015 season, Malik Zaire was the starting quarterback, but as we all know, early on in the season, he would go down and Kaiser would take over. In their first game in a win over Texas, Fuller would catch 7 passes for 142 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then the following week, with their backs against the wall, Fuller made one of the plays of the year. He went for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, and that second score was a late bomb in which they'd end up beating Virginia 34-27. After that, he'd have 6 catches for 131 yards and a touchdown against #14 Georgia Tech, and his first 3 games were absolutely insane. From there, he'd have a touchdown against UMass, and the Irish were off to a 4-0 start. After that, they'd play in a monsoon game against #12 Clemson, and they were not able to get the late 2-point conversion, so they lost. Fuller had the worst game of his career that night, but throwing the ball against Clemson, let alone a monsoon, was difficult. After that, he'd rebound with nearly 100 yards and a touchdown against Navy, 131 yards and a touchdown against USC, and then they'd be matched up with #21 Temple. Remember how much Fuller loved Philadelphia? Well, Temple was the hometown school, and game day was going to be going there. Under Matt Rule, the Owls were 7-0 and ranked in the top 25. This was the premier game, and what's funny is that was on Halloween night. Going into that matchup, he said it was going to be a special moment. He said, quote, "It's like a dream come true. I would have never thought about this happening. It's going to be really cool. When I was a freshman, I really wasn't paying much attention to it, and I was just excited to be playing Temple in South Bend. But it's an exciting feeling right now going back home and being one of the good players on the Notre Dame team." This game would end up being a classic as Fuller would catch 5 passes for 46 yards and a touchdown. They'd beat Temple 24-20, and they would continue their march to the playoff. After that, Fuller would catch 7 catches for 152 yards and 3 touchdowns against Pitt, and then help them beat both Wake Forest and Boston College. He was very limited in both of those games, but when Notre Dame needed him most, he would deliver. The Irish were still competing for a playoff spot at this time, but they would have to beat #9 Stanford on the road. Fuller caught 6 passes for 136 yards and a touchdown in this one, but unfortunately, Stanford would kick a late field goal, and Notre Dame would suffer their second loss of the year. Fuller would have to settle for the Fiesta Bowl, where Notre Dame would get beat by 2 scores against #7 Ohio State. This would end up being the final game of Will Fuller's Notre Dame career, as he catch 6 passes for 113 yards and a touchdown in that one. On the year, Fuller would catch 62 passes for 1,258 yards and 14 touchdowns. He did even better than the previous year, and this time he was named a second-team All-American. Fuller became one of the top receivers in the country and was now seen as one of the top receiver prospects in the draft. When he was headed into the 2016 NFL Draft, scouts were extremely high on him. They noted that he was extremely fast, had elite speed, was both a deep threat and a big play threat, was explosive, great at getting separation, had good stats, and had second gear speed. The downside was he was seen to have unreliable hands, caught the ball with his body too much, had a thin frame, and some worried he was a one-trick pony. Nevertheless, it didn't really matter, as the Houston Texans would trade up and take him with the 21st overall pick in the first round of the 2016 NFL Draft. Immediately, pairing him with DeAndre Hopkins was supposed to be their 1-2 punch, and many were super high on Fuller. 2016 would be the beginning of Will Fuller's NFL career, and his first season was actually great. He ended up starting 13 of the 14 games he played for the Texans, catching 47 passes for 635 yards and 2 touchdowns. That was pretty dang good for a rookie, and he was also a major factor in the return game. Will Fuller had set the tone for his career in his first season, but year 2, he would have a sophomore slump. In the 10 games he played, his numbers dropped to 28 receptions to 423 yards, but he had 7 touchdowns. While he was not having as much production, he was scoring the ball, and with him likely getting more targets in 2018, he could have his breakout season. Fortunately though, 2018 did not go according to plan. In his first 7 games, he caught 32 passes for 503 yards and 4 touchdowns, but eventually in week 8, he would tear his ACL, ending his season. He was off to a blazing start and was by far going to have his best season as an NFL player that year. This was very difficult for him, but he would bounce back slightly in 2019. In 11 games, he'd catch a career-high 49 passes for a career-high 670 yards and 3 touchdowns. Once again, Fuller was not reaching his peak, and it seemed like when he had a lot of catches and yards, he wasn't scoring the ball a lot, and when he didn't have as many catches, he was scoring more. It was definitely a strange first 4 years for him, but in 2020, he would show a glimpse of what he could be. He'd catch a career-high 53 passes for 879 yards and 8 scores. Not only was he productive in every area, but this was exactly the kind of player that the Texans had drafted. Except 2020 did not come without its pitfalls. Fuller was suspended 6 games for violating the league's substance policy, which would result in him missing the last 5 games of the 2020 season and the first game of the 2021 NFL season. What's crazy is he was having career highs and he missed out on 5 more in-game opportunities. 2020 was definitely peak Will Fuller, but at the same time, it was the beginning of the end for him. He'd end up getting let go of by the Texans and would move on and sign a 1-year deal with the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, he had to miss that first game, but after playing in only 2 games, he would break his thumb and was placed on IR for the remainder of the year. I'm not quite sure of the severity of the thumb injury, but I would not think that would cost him the entire year. That ended up being the case, and going into 2022, he was not picked up by a single team. After putting together his best season in 2020, that drug suspension was the beginning of the end, and a year later, he was out of the NFL, and I don't know if he'll be coming back anytime soon. Obviously, Will Fuller is no longer in the league, and honestly, some would consider him a draft bust. In his 6-year career, Fuller caught 213 passes for 3,136 yards and 24 touchdowns. What is unfortunate though is he never played an entire season, as he battled some sort of injury or had some sort of off-the-field problem every single season, and never once eclipsed the 1,000-yard receiving mark. He never had more than 10 touchdowns, and while his numbers were definitely respectable throughout his career, did he live up to that 21st overall pick hype? That's a question that I'm going to let you guys answer down below, but in my opinion, I would say that Fuller is a slight NFL draft bust. There are definitely players who had much worse careers than him, and there are also players who had better careers than him. So if we do label him a bust, what are the 3 things that caused his downfall? 1, it was missed time. Whether that was an injury or that suspension, him not being on the field and not being able to complete full seasons was definitely a red flag to the Texans and to other general managers, and it also stunted his stats. Secondly, scouts were worried that he was just a deep threat option and was not as versatile as other receivers, and it seems like that showed. And finally, you could put some small blame on the Texans. With how much of a dumpster fire that franchise has become and everything that went on in that 2019 and 2020 seasons, you could argue that coaching staff and that team did not help him, but also you could argue his 2 best seasons in the NFL were those 2 years, so maybe I don't make any sense. Either way, overall I blame it on missed time, his somewhat limited skills, and the organizations he played for. But what do you guys think? If you're a Texans, Notre Dame, or Dolphins fan, let me know down below. What do you think went wrong for Will Fuller? Who's another player or topic I could cover in my next video? And before you go, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.